Beneath the streets of New York, something long buried is stirring, a forgotten whisper echoing from concrete and shadow. When a vanished Union man and a missing shoe resurface after decades, Nero Wolfe must untangle a case where silence has been bought, sold, and sealed in stone. Some truths don't stay hidden forever, especially when the city itself wants them exhumed. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Let me know in the comments. Settle in, because this mystery begins now. It was a Thursday, and Fritz was in one of his euphoric moods, singing Schubert under his breath while whipping up something with eggs, mushrooms, and a vinaigrette that smelled like it had its own IQ. Wolfe was upstairs tending to the orchids, which meant peace reigned across the brownstone like a silent empress. Then came the knock. Except it wasn't a knock. It was a series of thuds, quick and panicked, like a man wasn't knocking to be let in, but to stop whatever was chasing him from catching up. Fritz glanced at me from the kitchen, eyebrows climbing like ivy. I shrugged, put down my coffee, and opened the front door. The man practically fell in. He was sweating through his overcoat despite the late autumn chill. His eyes were darting like he'd memorized the floor plan of hell and expected to be thrown back into it any minute. Fritz started to protest, something about appointments and propriety, but the man cut through the air with a single word. Safe. It wasn't shouted, but it landed like a slap. Wolfe didn't like chaos in the house. I didn't like sweaty men collapsing in our vestibule. But this one had a look in his eye that made me decide, for now, we'd bend the house rules. I guided him into the front room, one hand ready in case he decided to pitch forward again. Up close, he smelled like a damp subway rail, metal, sweat, and city grime that never washed off. I've dealt with my share of nervous clients, but this one looked less like a man with a guilty conscience, and more like one who'd been chased by it. He was in his mid-50s, I'd say, with a face that might have been carved kindly once, before fear hollowed out the edges. His hands trembled, twitching at his coat buttons like they were trying to flee his chest. Name? I asked, keeping my tone casual. Haskett, he breathed. Myron. I used to work for Transit. His eyes scanned the room like the ghosts of the Lexington line might come spilling out from behind the bookshelf. His voice was raspy, strained from either panic or years of tunnel air. Please, he said again, I need him. By him, I assumed he meant Wolfe. I also assumed he hadn't brought a checkbook. I opened my mouth to ask him if he wanted a glass of water or maybe a sedative, but he beat me to it, with a whisper. They buried it, he said, more to the floor than to me. Who did? He blinked, slow and pained, and managed to drag his eyes up to mine. They buried it under Manhattan, long time ago. They paid us not to speak, but I can't. His voice cut off like a fuse blown at the breaker. His knees buckled, and I had just enough time to grab an elbow and keep him from completely kissing the carpet. He sagged into my grip, breath heaving, face gone a waxy shade lighter. I eased him to the floor, called up to Wolfe, though I knew better than to expect footsteps. Wolfe doesn't descend stairs for emergencies. He barely does it for bacon. Haskett was murmuring something I couldn't make out. Then his head lolled back, and he went still. He'd made it to the one place in New York where logic is king. Unfortunately, he hadn't brought enough breath to explain himself. As expected, Wolfe didn't come down. Instead, his voice came floating down the stairs with all the gravity of a high court ruling. Archie, is he deceased? I'll let you know after I check for a pulse, I called back. Wolfe made a sound that implied this was far too theatrical for the hour. I knelt beside Haskett. The good news, he wasn't dead. The bad news, he wasn't exactly conducting trains either. Fritz hovered in the doorway, wringing a dish towel. He just collapsed, I muttered, probably shock, or whatever ghost he left behind in the tunnels caught up with him. Assist him to the settee, Wolfe commanded. Then return to your duties. I shall not be entertaining until after lunch. And if he dies on the upholstery? That, Wolfe said without pause, would be inconsiderate. No ambulance, no alarm, just another Thursday at West 35th Street. I made the mistake of listening to Wolfe. I left Haskett on the settee and ducked into the kitchen for ice water and, frankly, a moment to think. When I came back, less than 2 minutes later, the man was gone. No note, no groan of the front door, just an empty cushion and a dent in the carpet where he'd rested his head. I rushed to the front vestibule. No one on the stoop. I jogged to the curb and scanned the block. Nothing but a guy walking a schnauzer and a cab that wasn't waiting for me. I stepped back inside and noticed one thing he had left behind. His hat. It was a faded navy cap, the kind worn by conductors, with a silver MTA pin. It hung crookedly on the umbrella stand, like it had been placed there with deliberate haste. Back in the front room, the only sign of life was the faint scent of subway rust, and Wolfe's disapproval drifting faintly down the stairs. Back in the office, Wolfe sat in his chair, cradling his bulk as though gravity were a personal insult. He was reading Tacitus, which meant he was in no mood for interruptions, facts, or dead men missing hats. He's gone, I said. I gathered, Wolfe replied, not looking up. Left behind his hat. Then perhaps he intended to return. Or perhaps, I countered, he didn't want to be recognized above ground. That got a glance, brief, but real. I take it, Wolfe said slowly, that he offered neither name nor payment. He said he used to work transit, called himself Myron Haskett. Humph. Wolfe turned a page. Then this was not a client, it was an interruption. Sure, I said, but he interrupted us with a whisper about buried bodies under Manhattan. Archie, Wolfe sighed. The dead are always under Manhattan. That's where we place them. It wasn't the worst line he'd ever delivered, but something in me wasn't buying the interruption theory. That night, after the orchids were watered and the office lights were out, I couldn't sleep. The city outside hummed its usual lullaby of taxis and distant horns. But in my head, something was still whispering. They buried it under Manhattan. I'd heard crazier things. I'd seen crazier men. But there'd been a note in Haskett's voice, just beneath the panic, that didn't scream delusion. It suggested memory, and maybe guilt. I sat by the window with a beer and the hat he'd left behind. The lining was worn, sweat-stained. He'd used it, lived in it. It wasn't a prop. Whatever he'd meant to say, he'd decided to say it here. That counted for something. Somewhere, beneath the steel and concrete of the city, something had been sealed. And now it had started to whisper. It was one of those mornings when Fritz's eggs were cooked to an almost philosophical perfection. Firm where they needed to be, soft where they shouldn't be, and aromatic enough to make you momentarily forget every corpse and crackpot you'd ever encountered in New York City. I was halfway through bite number 3, already plotting my case for a second helping, when the front door started shaking under a barrage of fists that didn't believe in doorbells or subtlety. Fritz flinched like he'd just dropped his favourite copper pan. I gave him a half-apologetic shrug and made my way to the door, already knowing who it would be. Sure enough, when I yanked it open, there stood Inspector Kramer, rumpled, red-faced and steaming like the eggs I was about to mourn. He didn't wait for an invite. He brushed past me, grumbling something about your damn house rules, and headed straight for Wolfe's office with the urgency of a man who'd misplaced his last ounce of patience somewhere near the East River. Whatever breakfast piece we'd started with, it had just been traded for something far less digestible. By the time I reached the office, Kramer had planted himself squarely in front of Wolfe's desk like a traffic jam in human form. Wolfe, of course, had neither risen nor removed his hands from the chair's armrests. He simply raised an eyebrow as if Kramer's arrival was an irritating subplot in his morning. "I assume," Wolfe said coolly, "that you are not here to apologize for your rudeness yesterday." "I'm here," Kramer snapped, "because the man who dropped by your little nest yesterday is now very dead." Wolfe blinked once. I presume you mean Myron Haskett. Kramer's nostrils flared. You do know his name. That saves time. I took my place near the globe, leaning just enough to look casual. When last seen, I said. He was mumbling something about buried secrets and bolting for the door. Kramer turned back to Wolfe. He didn't just die. He got cooked, fried in a tunnel switch room that hadn't been opened in years. Power grid lit him up like a goddamn Christmas ham. Even Wolfe's expression shifted at that. Indeed, he murmured. Curious. I was thinking the same thing, just less politely. Wolfe exhaled through his nose, a sound reserved for particularly offensive reasoning or wilted spinach. Inspector, if you came to accuse, kindly equip yourself with logic. Mr. Haskett's arrival here was unsolicited. His departure was sudden. Whatever transpired afterward occurred without our knowledge or consent. Kramer folded his arms. He walks in here terrified, spills half a sentence, then shows up dead hours later in a place that hasn't seen a janitor in a decade. And you think that doesn't interest me? It should interest you exceedingly, Wolfe replied, but not in the way you suggest. Unless you wish to imply that I followed the man into a subway tunnel and electrocuted him with city infrastructure. I wouldn't put anything past you, Wolfe. Wolfe grunted. A tedious position, and one that invariably leads you to stumble rather than stride. Archie's rule number 7. When Wolfe starts using words like invariably, you'd better settle in. But for once, I didn't mind. The big man was warming up, and the kettle was starting to whistle. Kramer jabbed a finger toward Wolfe's desk, a maneuver that usually gets him exactly nowhere. I think you're holding out on me. Either that guy told you more than you're admitting, or you've got something he left behind. A note, maybe. A piece of evidence. Hell, maybe even the guy himself if you're playing games. Wolfe leaned back with exaggerated calm. Inspector, you presume too much. If Mr. Haskett had left anything tangible in this house, you would have seen it in your enthusiastic scouring of the premises yesterday. You arrived, you stomped, you sniffed, and you found nothing. Kramer looked like he wanted to bite the armrest. Then why the hell did he come here? Wolfe's eyes narrowed. That, he said, is precisely the question. And until you possess an answer, I suggest you withhold your accusations. I couldn't help it. I smirked. Kramer noticed. He always does. I'll say this, I put in, purely to be helpful. If he was looking for sanctuary, this wasn't the best address. Wolfe doesn't offer sympathy, and I don't offer free therapy. Kramer gave me a look usually reserved for chewing gum on his shoe. You think this is funny, Goodwin? I think it's Thursday, I replied. And I think a guy walked in here shaking like a subway turnstile, dropped half a mystery, and vanished before Fritz could bring him a napkin. Kramer growled something unintelligible, which I chose to interpret as colourful agreement. You really don't know what he was running from? He pressed. If we did, I said, we'd probably be running too. That got him pacing, which, in Wolfe's office, is about 3 strides and a turn. The room was tense, but not hostile. Yet. Not until Kramer dropped his next bomb. He was found, Kramer said slowly, in a sealed switch room below Wall Street. Maintenance crews haven't used it in 20 years. Power's supposed to be dead there. And yet he was electrocuted, Wolfe asked, hands tented. Cooked, Kramer replied. His shoes were scorched. So were the walls. Whatever's in there got hot real fast. I frowned. Wait a second. If the room was sealed, how'd he get in? Kramer gave me the look of a man who hadn't slept in a while and didn't like the smell of the puzzle. That's what I'm asking you. Only one entrance, locked from the outside. The key was in a defunct lockbox 3 floors up in a substation that's been mothballed since '04. So he teleported? I asked. Somebody unlocked it, Kramer said. Somebody wanted him inside. Then they turned on the juice. Wolfe's eyes were half-lidded now, but sharp as razors beneath. Deliberate, he said. Calculated, perhaps ritualized. That gave even Kramer pause. What the hell does that mean? It means, Wolfe said, someone sent a message. Kramer stepped forward, a bit too close for Wolfe's taste. I want everything, every word he said, every twitch he made. You've already received a summary, Wolfe replied. Further detail would be speculative at best and offensive at worst, I piped in. He did say something odd before collapsing. Something about being buried. Under Manhattan. Kramer grunted. You didn't think to mention that. You were busy trying to pin a murder on Wolfe's breakfast schedule, I said. Kramer's face went tight. If I find out you're sitting on anything. Wolfe's hand raised, like a conductor halting a particularly flat clarinet. Inspector, enough. If you return, do so with a warrant or with logic, preferably both. Until then, you are excused. Kramer's jaw flexed. You're going to regret stonewalling me, Wolfe. I regret many things, Wolfe replied, but never silence in the face of noise. Kramer slammed the door on his way out. Fritz winced from the kitchen. I turned to Wolfe. Well, that went well. He grunted. Phooey. And just like that, the tunnel beneath Manhattan opened another inch. Fritz's voice floated up the hall like a nervous cello string. When Fritz calls out my name instead of knocking, it means something has gone wrong in the vestibule, usually something involving heels and attitude. I set aside the day's mail, pushed back my chair, and strolled out just in time to witness a scene that would have made Wolfe choke on his beer. The woman was already halfway into the front room. She was mid-30s, brunette, sharp-chinned, and dressed like Fifth Avenue had personally approved her morning. Her heels clicked with confidence, and her glance around the brownstone was the kind that measured both square footage and self-worth in the same instant. I'm here to speak with Nero Wolfe, she announced, as if Wolfe had sent her a handwritten invitation. Fritz hovered behind her, looking apologetic and betrayed. He said you were not receiving visitors without appointment, he stammered, eyes pleading with me to handle this like a gentleman. Correction, she said without turning. I don't make appointments, I make introductions. She turned, stuck out her gloved hand. Carmela di Tullo. I took the hand. It was warm, dry, and carried the scent of almonds and litigation. Archie Goodwin, I said, the man who protects the man you barged in on. She smiled. Then you're exactly who I need. In Wolfe's office, she settled herself into the red chair like she'd been interviewed in it before. Her bag, expensive, square, and mean-looking, landed beside her with a thud. I moved to my usual spot near the globe, arms crossed. Wolfe, in his throne, observed her like a botanist encountering a carnivorous bloom. Miss di Tullo, he said, you are here uninvited, unannounced, and one assumes, unpaid. Justify. Carmela uncrossed her legs and raised an eyebrow. Myron Haskett came to you yesterday. That is not a question, Wolfe replied. It's the reason I'm here, she continued. He used to work for my father, Carmine di Tullo. You may have heard of him, city contractor, built half the tunnels under Lower Manhattan in the 30s. I have heard the name, Wolfe allowed. And the indictments. Dismissed, she said smoothly. And buried. Like most things in this city. She leaned forward slightly. Haskett worked under my father during the old tunneling contracts. He was part of a team called Section B9, and he knew things my father never. Wanted made public. Wolfe closed his eyes as if digesting this. Go on. She paused, then added, my father's dead, but his tunnels aren't. That got Wolfe's eyes back open. Coffee? I offered. Wolfe hates it when I play host without authorization, which is precisely why I do it. Carmela smiled and shook her head. No caffeine. Bad for circulation. Wolfe gave a low grunt, which meant either approval or irritation. With him, the line is academic. Miss di Tullo, he said, do try to avoid circumlocution. If you have knowledge of criminal intent, past or present, this is not the forum. I don't have knowledge, she said. I have suspicion. Wolfe sighed. Mr. Goodwin, I'm already listening, I cut in. If you're trying to convince us your father was connected to a corpse that hasn't been found yet, you're going to need to pour more than suspicion. I'm not asking you to believe me, she said, just to listen. Myron Haskett told me last month that something went wrong during one of the projects, something that got poured over and forgotten. She tapped her temple. He said it still kept him up. Wolfe, for once, was quiet. The air had changed. Carmela looked from Wolfe to me and back again. He came to me after my father's funeral, she continued. Out of nowhere. Said he had something to get off his chest. Said he thought the time had come to speak. And what, pray, Wolfe said, did he intend to reveal? That during a dig in 32, something or someone got sealed into the walls. She let that hang for a beat. Sealed, she repeated. As in, they closed the tunnel around it, cemented it in. I could practically hear the old subway walls groaning. He told me it was covered up, paid off, kept quiet. But he remembered it, and he was scared. Wolfe's fingers began to drum faintly on the armrest, always a sign of active curiosity. He said, she added, that one day the city would find the bones, that it was just a matter of time. I saw Wolfe shift slightly in his chair. That was the equivalent of another man fainting. Miss de Tullo, Wolfe said, your tale, though florid, is imprecise. You allege no crime by name, offer no evidence, and admit to hearsay gathered during a moment of grief. I didn't come with a file folder, she said evenly. I came because the man who whispered it to me is now dead. Wolfe's fingers paused. Yes, he said. Conveniently. Or purposefully, I added. Wolfe gave me a look, not of approval, but not quite contempt either. A mid-range signal, like a yellow traffic light. You knew Mr. Haskett? Wolfe asked her. No, not really. I remembered him vaguely from when I was a kid. I hadn't seen him in 20 years. Then why come now? Because I saw the name in the paper this morning, she said. And I remembered what he told me, and where he said it happened. Which was a maintenance tunnel off Chambers Street. That earned a silence so sharp it echoed. Wolfe sat back and laced his fingers together. You are not hiring me. No, she said. I can't. Not officially. Do you wish to? She hesitated. I don't think I could afford it. Wolfe's nostrils flared, as they always did, when the word afford entered the room without a wallet behind it. Mr. Tullo, he said, this house is not a bureau of lost urban legends. My services are finite, and my patience is currently rationed. Then do it, she said suddenly, because the man came to you before he died, because something's buried down there, and because your name is already tied to it whether you like it or not. That was well played. I gave her a mental point. Wolfe stared at her. Then, with deliberate slowness, he turned his head to me. Archie. Yes, sir? Schedule Mr. Panzer and prepare inquiries into city transit personnel rosters dating back to 1932. I raised an eyebrow. So we're taking the case? No, Wolfe said. We are investigating an insult. If Mr. Haskett's death proves coincidental, we shall cease. And if it doesn't? Wolfe's lips thinned. Then someone buried more than concrete. If you're ever in the mood for mildew, resentment, and rust in equal measure, I recommend a visit to the MTA's Lost Property Division down on Hudson. It's a concrete tomb full of unclaimed umbrellas, forgotten scarves, and enough anger to fill a subway car at rush hour. The clerk on duty was a gaunt fellow named Morris with the complexion of overboiled oatmeal and the temperament of a scratched record. Employee lockers? I asked, flashing credentials that technically weren't valid for his drawer, but looked official enough to win a war. Transit employees' stuff is private property, he grunted. Sure, I said. And I'm here to violate exactly that. Myron Haskett, retired conductor. You've got a box on him, or you wouldn't be stalling. He hesitated, then muttered something unkind and shuffled into the back. A few minutes later, he emerged with a cardboard container marked MH3357 and the look of a man about to betray a deeply personal philosophy. I thanked him, took the box to the far counter, and started sifting through 40 years of lint, metal tokens, and dust. Transit men don't leave diaries, but sometimes they leave maps. Buried beneath a stack of punch cards and a grimy MTA handbook, I found it, folded 6 ways to Sunday and yellowed like a twice-smoked cigar. A subway map, dated 1932. The lines were familiar, but there were annotations in grease pencil, hand-drawn tunnels that didn't appear on any modern schematic. The markings were deliberate, a heavy red circle around Section B9, tucked into a forgotten spur near Chambers Street. There were no directional notes, no legend, just a short, frantic scrawl in the corner. Don't forget what's behind. If that wasn't a breadcrumb, I didn't know what was. There was something in the script, tight, slightly slanted, and unsteady, that spoke more than the words themselves. This wasn't scribbled by a planner. It was written by a man who knew what fear felt like when it sat on your chest and waited to get heavier. I folded the map gently and tucked it into my jacket. I didn't know yet if it was pointing to bones, blueprints, or a metaphor. But in Wolfe's office, metaphors got the same attention as murder weapons. Back at the brownstone, I laid the map on Wolfe's desk like it was holy scripture. He regarded it as he does all physical evidence, with disdain tempered by intellect. "This," he said, lifting a brow, "is not a diagram, it is an invitation." "Courtesy of a dead man," I added. Wolfe leaned forward, his eyes narrowing behind the half-moons. "The ink is original, so is the pencil, but the intention, that is contemporary." He tapped the red circle with his forefinger. "Section B9. That designation ceased usage in 1941. You'd know that offhand?" "I retain useful information," he said. I waited, but the next line didn't come. Wolfe simply stared at the paper for a moment longer, then closed his eyes. "There is something beneath the city, Archie. Something sealed. And someone, perhaps Haskett, wanted it found." I nodded, which means someone else wants it very much not found. Wolfe's eyes opened. "Find out who signed the original B9 permits. Start with those who profit from forgetting." Which in New York was a long and distinguished list. If you spend enough time digging through city contracts from the 30s, you're bound to stumble over someone who used to own a machine gun. In this case, that someone was Vito Cirello, known to the tabloids as the Torch, which had less to do with arson than his former fondness for fiery speeches at union rallies, real and staged. Cirello made his bones bootlegging during Prohibition and traded his Tommy gun for blueprints when tunnels became more profitable than gin. By the time the war ended, he was a legitimate contractor in the eyes of every zoning board he hadn't bribed. I found him, not in person, but in a photograph archived at the city permit office. It showed a younger Haskett, still muscular and moustached, shaking hands with a slim, smirking man whose suit probably cost more than my annual laundry bill. The caption was dated July 1932. The job site was, you guessed it, Section B9. The connection was undeniable. Haskett had worked under Cirello, and based on the way Cirello grinned for the camera, he'd known the value of burying things long before Myron Haskett ever whispered a word. Cirello's office sat in a grey brick building on East 49th that smelled like air conditioning and old cash. The plaque read, Cirello Urban Development, but the door was watched by 2 men who looked like their resumes consisted of weightlifting, intimidation, and punctuation-free threats. I introduced myself to the one with the shorter neck. "I'd like a moment with Mr. Cirello." The taller one gave a headshake that looked practiced. "No meetings today." "Tell him it's regarding a city project from 1932. That made Shortneck blink. "You with the city?" "No, I'm with the future." He didn't like that, but he stepped inside. 5 minutes later, he returned with a shrug. "Mr. Cirello says he don't remember tunnels from 90 years ago. That's okay," I said. "I remember for him." I left without pressing further. No point squeezing a brick wall unless you know where the cracks are. But I had no doubt he'd be squeezing back soon enough, once he realized what I was holding, and who might already know it. Back at the brownstone, I handed the map over to Saul Panzer with strict instructions. Saul's version of safekeeping makes Fort Knox look like a sandbox. If I trusted anyone in this town with a sensitive piece of evidence, it was him. That night, I had dinner with Lily Rowan, and for 3 hours I managed not to think about sealed tunnels or sweaty conductors. The moment I got back to Saul's office, the illusion vanished. He met me at the door with a tight face I'd only seen twice before, once when a suspect tried to poison his cat, and once when a bullet missed him by a foot. "It's gone," he said. "What?" "The safe's still locked. No sign of forced entry. Nothing's disturbed, but the envelope's gone." I checked myself. "Did you open the safe since I dropped it?" "No," he said. "I haven't touched it." That meant someone had the combination, or something better, and that someone had known exactly what to look for. I didn't like it. Wolfe wouldn't either. Someone wasn't just chasing the truth. They were stealing the pieces behind us. Wolfe took the news like a man receiving a prophecy he already suspected. He was in the office, mid-beer, when I gave him the update. He did not slam his glass down. He didn't even raise his voice. But he did speak. "We are now in motion." "That's not comforting," I replied. "It's not meant to be," he said. "This incident confirms what we suspected. We are not the only ones aware of Haskett's clues. And whoever's ahead of us plays for keeps." Wolfe nodded. "And has resources, either political or criminal." "Or both," I muttered. He reached for the globe, spun it lightly, then stopped it with a single finger. "Mr. Goodwin, inform Mr. Panzer to recheck every point of contact he used since receiving the map. Then begin digging into Vito Cirello's financials for the past 12 months. Look for payments labeled consulting, waste removal, or unspecified concrete work," I offered. Wolfe grunted. "Precisely." We were no longer chasing shadows. Now the shadows were watching us. There are worse ways to spend a morning than traipsing through an abandoned tunnel off Chambers Street with rats that have union pensions and a flashlight that flickered like it was nervous. I had Carmela's tip, and Wolfe's reluctantly granted approval, which meant I was on the scent. Unfortunately, the scent was mold, rust, and a generous helping of trouble. The spur had once served a utility crossover. Now it was a concrete artery to nowhere. Locked to the public, unlit, and allegedly decommissioned, it was the kind of place that would make a corpse feel at home. The city still listed the section as inaccessible. The city also once listed prohibition as enforceable. As far as I could tell, the door hadn't been opened in years, but the rust gave way with enough effort, and a crowbar borrowed from a sanitation depot guard who owed me a favor. The tunnel's air was thick and dead. Every footstep echoed like a bad idea. About 40 yards in, I noticed something that didn't belong. A bent flashlight, still warm. Either I wasn't alone, or I'd missed someone by minutes. Either way, that's when I smelled something worse than trouble. That's when I smelled death. He was slumped against the curve of the wall, half hidden by a rusted tool rack and a bucket of crumbled cement that looked like it had last seen use when Roosevelt was a colonel. The man was dead, no question. He had the loose limbs and sunken jaw of someone whose clock had stopped ticking while he still had plans. His grey blazer had a small city-issued badge clipped to the lapel. It read, "Mallory, Theo, Engineering and Inspection." I knelt beside him. His throat was mottled with bruises, faint, but unmistakable. Not a mugging. No wallet was missing. His left hand still gripped a metal clipboard. But the strangest part was his feet, or more precisely, his footwear. One shoe, Italian, polished, narrow and expensive, was missing. The sock remained, pulled slightly down, like it had been yanked. The other shoe was intact, untouched. Why take one, and why him? Theo Mallory hadn't been on any list Carmela gave me, but the clipboard had inspection notes dated 2 days ago. Someone had brought him down here recently, and someone had made sure he didn't come back up. I don't make a habit of checking steel handrails for makeup, but this one demanded a second glance. Near the access ladder, above the second rung, was a faint smudge of coral-coloured lipstick, shiny, recent, and definitely not city-issued. It was out of place in a way that practically whistled. The tunnel hadn't seen light or lipstick in decades, and suddenly I had both a dead city engineer and a smear of cosmetics that looked like it belonged in a midtown cocktail bar. There was no cigarette burn, no cigarette, just the smear. Either someone had touched their lips to the rail, or more likely, their hand to their mouth and then to the metal in haste. Fear does strange things to people. So does guilt. The combination of expensive cologne on the corpse and coral lipstick on the handrail told me 2 things. 1. Mallory had company. 2. She hadn't stuck around. The tunnel had answers, and at least one of them had left her prints in rouge. I returned to the brownstone with dust in my lungs, and a story Wolfe was guaranteed to hate. He was at his desk, reading a monograph on Byzantine coin forgery. It was either that or something worse, like a history of paving methods in Mesopotamia. I gave him the highlights. He let me finish. Pfui, he said, delicately laying the book aside. You disapprove, I observed. I disapprove, he intoned, of the city's continuing commitment to hide its rot beneath concrete and bureaucracy, and of you for descending into a derelict tunnel for a corpse and returning with no more than metaphors and a missing shoe. It wasn't metaphorical bruising, I said. Mallory was strangled. Wolfe nodded once. And the shoe. One gone, one left behind, both expensive. Suggestive, either symbolic or calculated. Or just weird, I said. He looked down his nose. You are not paid to be whimsical. No, I said. I'm paid to find lipstick in tunnels and get growled at for it. Regrettable, Wolfe said, and entirely consistent with the theme of resurgent guilt. Mallory's personnel file at City Planning painted him as a model civil servant, punctual, discreet, and as dull as oatmeal. No write-ups, no scandals, and a pension fund that would have made an actuary weep with joy. But Theo had a tick in his final year that caught my eye. He'd closed 5 safety audits in the last 8 months. One of them, dated last week, was flagged for final review and never submitted. The name of the project: B9, Disused Utility Tunnel. I traced the routing forms. They'd gone unsigned. The last signature box? Left blank. Mallory had walked into that tunnel with a clipboard and a conscience. Something he saw down there had made him pause. Or someone. He hadn't told anyone, but he'd gone back. And this time, someone had gone with him. Someone who made sure the report stayed unfinished, and that the shoes didn't match. I brought Wolfe the photos, the inspection forms, and the shoeprint sketch Saul managed from my description. He stared at them, fingers steepled. The missing shoe, he said, was not removed for theft. No, I agreed. Nothing else was taken. He nodded. It was removed to signal something. Like what? One-shoed people aren't exactly trending. Symbols, Mr. Goodwin, are not defined by trends. They are defined by their audience. Whoever removed that shoe knew someone would understand. And if we don't, then we are behind, Wolfe said. He stood, a rare gesture which meant thought had turned into decision. Theo Mallory discovered something, and whoever he told, or whoever followed, chose to silence him theatrically. You think the lipstick was part of the act? No, that was incidental. A moment of panic. The shoe was not. Could it mean, I asked, that the body we haven't found is still wearing the match? Wolfe raised an eyebrow. That, he said, would be elegant. In his vocabulary, elegant was reserved for geometry, orchids, and homicide when done with style. We had one map gone, one engineer dead, one conductor previously fried, and no client handing Wolfe a check. Which, if you're unfamiliar with his temperament, is like asking a prize hog to skip lunch because the trough isn't aesthetically pleasing. I leaned on the edge of his desk. "We've got 2 bodies," I said. "We've got lipstick, lost shoes, a missing map, and you're doing all this for what?" "For clarity," Wolfe replied. "Clarity doesn't pay the bills." He stared at me. "Clarity may prevent a 3rd corpse." That shut me up, for a moment anyway. But I knew him. The death of Haskett had irritated him. The loss of the map had piqued him. But Mallory's murder, that had crossed a line. "Still no client," I said again, more to myself. "No," Wolfe agreed, "but we are building the shape of one." "Who?" "The kind," he said, "who reveals themselves only when cornered." Outside, the city went on, pretending it didn't bury its problems. Inside, Wolfe prepared to dig them up. Fritz's bacon was crisp enough to crunch in the air, and the eggs had a fluff to them that could win a ribbon at the state fair if Wolfe ever deigned to enter food competitions. As it stood, breakfast was what passed for peace in the brownstone, until it wasn't. Wolfe, in his robe, was at the dining table, fork in hand, pausing between bites with the same ceremonial pace he used for crime scene photos. I, meanwhile, was halfway through my 2nd cup of coffee when the bell rang, not once, but twice. "They've arrived," I said. "I heard," Wolfe grumbled. By they, he meant suspects, invited under pretext, but in reality, on the docket for one of Wolfe's informal inquests. Informal meaning no subpoenas, but still more intimidating than most courtrooms. Wolfe stood, dabbed his mouth with a linen napkin, and declared, "We shall proceed." He didn't say grill, but that's what it was. Not sausages this time. Suspects. 3 of them. One with family guilt, one with criminal polish, and one with a freshly widowed scent of roses and lies. Breakfast was over. The real cooking had begun. We began with Carmela. She wore a navy blouse, a look of contained confidence, and lipstick 1 shade too cheerful for the day's purpose. She took the red chair across from Wolfe's desk and folded her hands like a lawyer at a deposition. "I've told you what I know," she began. "And," Wolfe said, "what you omitted. I'm not sure I understand. You claimed yesterday that your father's company had no involvement in tunnel construction," Wolfe said. Yet the New York Tribune, dated March 2, 1934, records Carmine DiTullo's bid and subsequent contract for subterranean development under Lower Manhattan. Specifically, Section B9. She blinked, once. Slowly. "I never said he didn't have contracts. I said they weren't connected to this." "You used the phrase nothing to do with tunnels." "That's a very specific nothing." She shifted in her seat. "Fine. He had city contracts. So did a dozen other firms. That doesn't make him guilty of anything." "No," Wolfe agreed. "It makes him part of a puzzle, one you continue to solve selectively." She raised an eyebrow. "I thought you wanted answers." "I do," Wolfe replied. "Just not the edited kind." The silence that followed was tight enough to snap. Wolfe leaned back in his chair, gaze resting on Carmela, like he was cataloguing an orchid with wilting roots. "Your father paid off city officials," he said calmly. "That was never proven, but not denied." She gave a half smile that didn't reach her eyes. "What does it matter now? He's dead. The books are closed." "No, Mr. DiTullo. The books were buried. We are unearthing them." "You want to know what I think?" she asked, sitting forward. "I think you're digging because it makes you feel superior, not because you care who's dead under some tunnel." I could have stepped in, but I wanted to see Wolfe's reaction. He blinked slowly. "I do not require emotional engagement to pursue logic. Haskett's death, and now Mallory's, prove this matter has not been entombed. It has merely been waiting." She looked away. "He mentioned once, years ago, that someone was paid to stay quiet. A worker. I didn't think it meant anything." Wolfe's voice dropped. "But you remembered it." and chose not to share it until now. She said nothing. Wolfe tapped his finger once on the desk. A verdict, not a question. Veto the torch. Sorello arrived 20 minutes late and entirely unapologetic. His suit was grey with a lavender pocket square, and his cologne preceded him into the room like a press agent. He didn't shake hands, just sat. "Mr. Wolfe," he said, "you got something burning? Or is this just about some old concrete?" "I was under the impression," Wolfe said, "that your career pivoted from bootlegging to urban renewal." Sorello grinned. "Don't forget sanitation." "I wouldn't dare." Sorello turned toward me. "You the kid who stopped by my office?" "I'm 38, I said, "but I'll take the compliment." "Good. Then you know I got nothing to say about some conductor with cold feet and a dirty conscience." Wolfe's brow creased. "You deny knowing Myron Haskett?" "I remember the name. He ran crews back in the day. Haven't seen him since Roosevelt was in office." "Franklin or Teddy?" I asked. He chuckled. "I'll take the fifth." Wolfe didn't smile. "You'll take something, I assure you." I walked to the bookshelf, pulled a slim manila folder and handed it to Wolfe. He opened it, scanned a page, then passed it to Sorello like a priest offering a wafer. Sorello didn't flinch, but he did read it. "Payment ledger," I said. "Filed through a shell contractor last month. Shows a $10,000 consulting fee made to M. Haskett. Recipient confirmed by bank ID." Sorello took a breath and leaned back. "That wasn't a bribe." "No?" Wolfe asked. "That was nostalgia. The old man needed help. I paid him out of respect." "A respect that left him electrocuted in a sealed room," I said. "I didn't kill him." "No," Wolfe agreed. "But you remembered him more than you claimed." Sorello shrugged. "I forgot a lot of names. That one came back when I saw it in the obits." Wolfe steepled his fingers. "Then perhaps you'll also recall the name of the engineer found yesterday in a disused tunnel." Sorello didn't answer. Sometimes silence says more than protest. Mrs. Mallory arrived with a cloud of lilac perfume and eyes dry enough to light a match. She was tall, lean, and looked like she spent more time at auction houses than funerals. She took the red chair with an ease that suggested this wasn't her first interrogation by someone in a better chair. "My condolences," Wolfe began. She nodded. "Thank you. It was sudden." "Yes," he said. "Death by strangulation often is." She flinched, barely. "I thought Theo was retired," she offered. "He wasn't taking city work anymore." "His badge log says otherwise," I said. "He clocked in 3 days ago on an inspection run." She frowned. "That's not possible." "Do you recognize this?" Wolfe slid the inspection form toward her. "Your husband's signature, dated this week." She looked at it but didn't touch it. "I don't know why he'd go back. He didn't need the money." "No," Wolfe murmured, "but perhaps he needed the answers." The silence stretched until her knuckles whitened around her purse strap. Wolfe gestured toward the far table where I had laid out the documents. Old blueprints, faded contract filings, and a single stamped memo marked "Cancelled, B9 Project, July 1933. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Each of you has claimed ignorance, and yet each of you knows something about Bore 9. Carmela looked up sharply. "That project was erased," Wolfe finished. "Officially, and yet it appears in your father's contracts, Mr. Sorello's payment trail, and your late husband's inspection record." Sorello leaned back, arms folded. "That's a lot of paper and not much blood." "2 corpses say otherwise," I said. Wolfe stood, rare and unsettling. Bore 9 was sealed under false pretenses. An accident, perhaps, or a murder. It was buried, but not forgotten. And now, as those connected begin to vanish, the truth attempts to breathe. Carmela whispered, "You think someone's still trying to keep it hidden?" "I think," Wolfe replied, "that someone never stopped." And judging by the faces in the room, at least one of them had just remembered the smell of fresh concrete. The trick with retired men is this: They know more than they'll admit, and they want more than they'll confess. Especially the crusty ones with yellowed undershirts and opinions about grout. Hank Goebel was Exhibit A. I found him right where the city pension system left him, on the 4th floor of a walk-up in Brooklyn, staring out the window like he was still inspecting tunnels that hadn't existed for 60 years. The living room smelled like old upholstery and cheap pipe tobacco. The fridge had 2 things: beer and liverwurst. "So, you're the guy that called," he said, scratching at a spot just above his gut. Didn't say what this was about. I smiled. "You worked bore 9 in 33. I'm offering you 20 minutes of your time and a pastrami on rye." His eyes narrowed. "Add a second sandwich, and maybe I remember my own name." I pulled a second wrap stack from the bag. Done. 5 minutes later, the sandwiches were gone, and the honesty kicked in, slow and greasy. He wiped his fingers. "I kept one thing, something you might want to hear." My ears perked. So did my wallet. Goebel shuffled over to a rusted filing cabinet disguised as a nightstand and yanked open the bottom drawer. After a minute of rummaging through what I can only describe as a museum of municipal regrets, he pulled out a blue cookie tin, the kind that used to hold Danish butter cookies and now held regret. "Here," he said, placing it on the table like it was a holy relic. "You didn't get this from me." "Of course not," I said. "You're just a figment of my overactive imagination." He opened the tin. Inside was a reel of wax-coated wire, brittle enough to snap if someone coughed near it. Scribbled on the label in red pencil was one line: Bore 9, Jan 33. This was recorded by one of the engineers, late night, after the shift. He said if anything ever happened to him, someone should know. I just didn't want it to be me. I whistled low. "You ever listen to it?" He shook his head. "I like sleeping at night." I thanked him with a handshake and a 20. I left with history in a tin and a hunch that sleep would be overrated for the next few days. Wolfe wasn't exactly thrilled about the wire reel sitting on his Persian rug like a time bomb in pastry disguise. But the man was curious, which, for Wolfe, is a dangerous form of enthusiasm. "I suppose," he muttered. "This is why you missed lunch." "I had pastrami," I replied. "Don't worry, Goebel didn't ask me to stay the night." Fritz was already moving the phonograph into the living room. We don't often use it for anything but Mozart or Strauss, but the needle didn't seem to mind a little detour into subterranean horror. "Handle it delicately," Wolfe said, watching Fritz like a museum guard. "This is likely the only extant copy." "Of something no one's supposed to hear," I added. Wolfe ignored me. He instructed Fritz to leave, closed the doors, dimmed the lights, and dropped into his chair like a judge preparing to pronounce sentence. "Silence," he said. The needle dropped. The wire hissed. And then, beneath the static, a voice emerged, cracked, trembling, and steeped in guilt. It was a man's voice, middle-aged by the sound of it, educated but unraveling. The first minute was a muddled slush of humming and throat-clearing, like the man had started recording and couldn't bring himself to speak. Then, finally, "This is... God! I don't know if I should say my name. This is for whoever finds this. I was on the crew at Bore 9. I was one of the engineers. We didn't report it. We were told not to. We walled it in." A pause, the kind that fills a room like smoke. There was a worker. He wasn't on the list. Came down, said he had clearance. But he saw something, heard something. I don't even know what. But by the time the night shift ended, he was gone. The foreman said, "We seal it. No paperwork. No trace." And we did. Another pause, longer this time. I could feel Wolfe leaning forward without actually seeing it. "We sealed it forever. God forgive us. I didn't even know his name." The reel crackled. Wolfe didn't move. Neither did I. Wolfe sat perfectly still for a count of 10, then reached over and lifted the needle like he was silencing a ghost. He turned to me. "We shall hear it again. I rewound the wire with the care of a man handling nitroglycerin. The hiss returned. The voice followed. This time, Wolfe scribbled notes, his lips moving silently as he matched phrases to timelines, inflections to probability. When it reached the words, "We sealed it forever," he held up a finger. "Stop there." I stopped. That is not an expression of metaphor. It is literal. They constructed a barrier, cement or steel, likely behind existing supports, and buried the man within. I blinked. Which means he's still there. Wolfe nodded. It also means the conspiracy began not with murder, but with silence, and that silence became policy. He tapped the real case once, firmly. This confession is not a curiosity. It is a cornerstone. He was warming up to something, and I had a feeling the temperature was about to rise. "I don't usually like to disturb your momentum," I said. "But if this guy was entombed behind a fake wall, maybe he's still back there." Wolfe looked at me, surprised. I continued. "If Bore 9 was shut down quietly and the official maps redrawn, maybe nobody ever went back in. No demolition, no repaving, just paperwork. You know, Manhattan-style amnesia." Wolfe didn't bristle, which was already suspicious. Instead, he gave a slow nod. "Mr. Goodwin, you are, on this rare occasion, correct." He turned back toward the reel. "The corpse, if intact, would be nearly skeletal. But bones do not lie, nor do they forget." I added, "And if we find them?" He steepled his fingers. "Then we shall have the one thing this case has lacked." "What's that?" "Proof. Immutable, irrefutable, and inconvenient for anyone who wished it buried." I made a note to call Saul. We'd need someone willing to crawl into a sealed-off tunnel with a flashlight and questionable life insurance. The reel ended with a hiss. One long breath of exhaustion from a machine that had carried its secret for nearly 50 years. Wolfe stood slowly, like he was lifting the weight of a century off his spine. "Gentlemen," he said, even though the only gentleman present was me, "if bones do not lie, it is time to find them." He walked toward the globe in the corner, spun it lazily with a fingertip, then stopped it on Manhattan. "Call Mr. Panzer. Have him find any trace of sub-basement schematics. Also Mr. Parker. He's had success with ground-penetrating sonar, yes?" "Yes," I said, "and a strong stomach." "Good. He'll need both." I stood too. "And if we find the bones?" Wolfe looked at the tin one last time. "Then the silence ends." He didn't say it, but I knew what came next. Suspects called back. Alibis cracked open, and one dead man, finally given the last word he was denied when the concrete closed in. There are days when the brownstone feels like a monastery, and others when it feels like a powder keg. That afternoon, it was both, except the chanting monks were replaced with grumpy suspects, and the powder had a fuse named Wolfe. By 3 o'clock, I had the front room arranged with military precision. Wolfe insisted each chair be exactly 4 feet from the center of the room and angled, not toward me, Mr. Goodwin, but toward the inevitable. I didn't argue. You don't interrupt Michelangelo when he's sketching the ceiling. The air was cool, thanks to Fritz's devotion to air conditioning maintenance, and the beer in the cabinet had been replenished, though Wolfe wouldn't touch a drop until the whole thing was over. Fritz floated through with a tray of cucumber sandwiches no one wanted, and enough composure to teach yoga. "You expect them to confess on cue?" I asked. "I expect," Wolfe replied, not looking up from his notes, "that when truth is placed on the stage, some actors forget their lines and some forget their masks." The doorbell rang. Cue the first reluctant understudy. Inspector Kramer arrived like a thundercloud in a bad suit. He didn't shake off the rain. He brought it in with him. "Goodwin," he barked, brushing past me. "I'm too old to be summoned like a bellboy at the plaza." "You're lucky," I said. Wolfe thought about sending a bell. One of those big brass ones from a hotel lobby. He grunted and stalked into the front room, his eyes scanning the setup with the practiced scowl of a man who's seen too many parlors and not enough donuts. "What's this? Theatre seating?" Wolfe, seated and serene, looked up. "Inspector, thank you for coming." "I didn't come, I was hauled." "You called the commissioner. He called the chief. The chief called me. That's not an invitation. It's a subpoena with flowers." Wolfe gestured toward the armchair opposite him. "Please. What I'm about to disclose concerns city corruption, criminal conspiracy, and a murder long buried." Kramer folded his arms. "You better be right, Wolfe. I cancelled golf." "You won't need it," Wolfe said. "What I have planned is a far more satisfying form of execution." Within the next 15 minutes, the brownstone turned into a casting call for guilt. Carmela Trantino arrived first, her lawyer's instinct buried under an inch of foundation and 3 inches of attitude. She took the far right seat and crossed her legs like a fencer preparing for duel. Right behind her came Charles Sorello, the contractor with slicked back hair and the general demeanor of a man who'd rather be dealing with cement than conversation. He took a chair, glanced at Wolfe, and didn't bother to hide his disdain. Then came Mrs. Mallory, silk scarf fluttering, eyes scanning the room like she was trying to spot a social event that wasn't a trap. She greeted me with a frozen smile and ignored Wolfe completely. And finally, the archivist, poor Mr. Bryson, who looked like he'd wandered in from a book restoration seminar and realized too late he'd landed in a tribunal. His collar was wilted and his nerves were louder than the ticking clock on the mantel. They all sat, they all sweated, and Wolfe, composed as a Roman senator, cleared his throat and began his lecture. "Ladies and gentlemen," Wolfe began, his voice smooth enough to iron shirts with, "you are here because in 1932, a set of tunnel contracts were signed under conditions that would, if examined today, constitute federal offenses." He leaned back slightly, fingers steepled. The city's subway expansion, specifically Bore 9, was rushed, unregulated, and riddled with bribes. Engineering permits were falsified, safety protocols circumvented, and the Oversight Committee, chaired by one Mr. Roston, had the gall to ask why. There was a rustle of discomfort in the room. Sorello coughed. Carmela stiffened. Wolfe continued. "Mr. Roston disappeared in January of 1933. No body, no police report, no family statement. His name was erased from records, but not from memory. An engineer, fearful and guilt-stricken, left behind a confession, recorded in wax wire." Kramer squinted. "You serious?" "I am never otherwise," Wolfe replied. "The confession describes how Mr. Roston was murdered, on orders, and entombed within the tunnel's structure to silence him and protect a burgeoning empire built on fraudulent labor." Mrs. Mallory tried to stand. "Sit," Wolfe said without raising his voice. She did, and Wolfe gave a slight smile, the kind you see before a guillotine drops. Wolfe didn't pause. He was in full orchestral stride. The recording specifies the body was walled into an access chamber behind panel D7, sealed with non-reinforced concrete and covered by a falsified maintenance panel. The man who ordered this atrocity was in direct conflict with Roston's oversight, someone who stood to gain if Roston vanished. He turned his gaze on Sorello. "Your father, Mr. Sorello, was the supervising contractor on Bore 9. Sorello blinked. Wolfe shifted his attention to Mrs. Mallory. "And your late husband was on the permit council. He approved the altered blueprints 2 days after Roston disappeared." She paled. "That was decades ago." Wolfe raised a hand. "Crimes age. But guilt, madam, ferments." Carmela looked between them. "You're suggesting my firm is involved in this? That's absurd." "No," Wolfe said. "Not your firm. You. You've overseen legal affairs for Mallory Holdings since 2009. You ensured that no new inspections were ever permitted at the Bore 9 site. You kept the grave untouched." Kramer growled. "You got proof?" Wolfe nodded once. "Coming up." He tapped a small stack of papers beside him. "Bones speak, gentlemen, but so do bonuses." Wolfe lifted the papers with a flourish, like a magician revealing the rabbit, and maybe the murder weapon too. Mr. Haskett, recently deceased, was no fool. He had begun cataloguing discrepancies in municipal finance reports and backdated engineering documents. He located maps. He contacted Mr. Panzer, and he found a payment. He handed one page to Kramer, who took it like it might bite. Haskett traced a $5,000 disbursement logged in 1933, marked as a concrete bonus. It was paid to a non-existent employee, one with a misspelled name, Rostam. The check was processed through a shadow account tied to a dormant Union shell company. Cirello shifted in his seat. Mallory's fingers clenched around her purse. Haskett confronted someone. We do not yet know whom, but within a week, he was dead. Wolfe let that linger. Silence, used properly, is heavier than a gavel. Bryson, the archivist, whispered, "That's why he asked for the Bore 9 files." Wolfe nodded. Yes, he died for following a paper trail that others paved with blood and buried in concrete. I saw Kramer's eyes narrow. He knew what was coming next. So did they. "Observe," Wolfe said, sliding another paper across the table. A check dated February 12, 1933, endorsed by a C. Mallory, authorized by J. Cirello Engineering, and signed on behalf of the Union Benefits Office. The problem? That office ceased operations in January, and the signatory, Rostam, was by then dead. Cirello bolted upright. "You can't prove that signature's real." "I don't need to," Wolfe replied. "The ink is. So is the bank's stamp, and the date." Mrs. Mallory's lips moved, but no sound emerged. Carmela hissed, "This is hearsay, circumstantial." "No," Wolfe said. "It is arithmetic. The check existed. The office did not. The man who signed it was already walled in." Kramer stepped forward, eyes locked on Mallory. "You knew." She stood, too quickly. "I want my lawyer." "You'll need him," Wolfe said. Cirello muttered something profane. Wolfe ignored it. I was already dialing the DA's office. The silence in the room was no longer composed. It was collapsing. Cirello lunged forward, red-faced. "You set us up. You—" Wolfe raised a brow. "You set yourselves up in 1933. I simply unsealed the vault." Carmela's face turned to stone. Mallory sat, lips trembling. Bryson looked ready to faint. Wolfe held up one final sheet. "The engineer's confession has been cross-referenced with city archives. The dates match. The construction logs, buried but not lost, confirm the panel's abrupt sealing." He turned to Kramer. "You may now excavate, Inspector." Kramer nodded, jaw tight. "We'll need permits." Wolfe leaned back. "Then let the city dig up what it chose to forget." The call from the district attorney came at 10:14 a.m., interrupting Wolfe's third attempt to identify the base spice in Fritz's latest quiche. I answered it, of course. Wolfe, answering the phone voluntarily, would require either the collapse of civilization or an eggplant uprising. When I hung up, Wolfe raised an eyebrow. "I presume that is what passes for progress in the public sector." "The DA has greenlit the dig," I told him. "We can go ahead with the excavation at the Chambers Street spur." "Splendid," Wolfe said, not moving a muscle. "You may summon Inspector Kramer. He enjoys destruction, preferably with dust." "You're not coming?" "My dear Archie," Wolfe said, folding his hands over the curve of his stomach like a cat contemplating a sunbeam. "My contribution is conceptual. Manual labor, as you well know, is inimical to both my temperament and my constitution." "Fine," I muttered. "I'll bring a souvenir, maybe a femur." "I have one," he replied, and reached for his beer. Which is how I ended up dialing Kramer, preparing myself for more concrete than courtesy. At precisely 3:47 that afternoon, I stood 15 feet underground beneath the Chambers Street station, eyeing a team of city-hired forensic diggers as they wheeled in a jackhammer with all the grace of a wedding cake on a skateboard. Kramer was already there, arms folded and frown calibrated to volatile. "You better be right, Goodwin," he growled, his voice echoing off the tile. "Because if we bust up a century-old tunnel for nothing, I'll have you writing traffic tickets in Yonkers." "You wound me, Inspector," I said. "This is cultural archaeology, with an air of noir. Cut the wisecracks. Show them where to drill." I pointed to a patch of wall that, on Wolfe's notes and Goebel's tape, matched the likely burial spot of our entombed engineer. The jackhammer revved up with the subtlety of a jazz trumpet in a monastery, and chips of concrete began to fly like bureaucratic excuses at budget time. Sweat beaded down the foreheads of the crew. Kramer barked orders, I supervised, and New York hummed far above, indifferent to what we might dig up below. Then the drill hit something it wasn't expecting. The first oddity wasn't visual, it was auditory. A dull thunk, followed by the shift in tone no jackhammer guy wants to hear unless he's busting open a safe. "Hold it," I said, stepping forward. The wall segment we were focused on had a different color cast, a shade paler than the century-old concrete around it. Not by much, but enough that a guy who notices neckties at funerals could tell the difference. "Test it," Kramer ordered. The foreman pulled out a digital scanner and waved it across the slab. The tool gave a feeble blip, confused, just like our archivist had been when Wolfe summoned him. The spot wasn't marked on any plan from the 1930s, nor any post-war retrofits. "It's newer," I said, "but not recent. Maybe mid-century." The foreman knocked gently. A hollow ring answered back. "Great," Kramer muttered. "The only thing worse than old crime is forgotten crime." I leaned in. This might be Bore 9's tombstone. He stared at me. "Then let's crack the headstone." The jackhammer resumed, now with precision. The process was like peeling a scab off history, loud, dusty, and bound to reveal something nasty underneath. 20 minutes in, the wall began to crumble inward. The concrete fractured along hairline seams like it had been poured in a hurry, maybe with more fear than finesse. The moment the last chunk fell, a cold draft of stale air whispered out, as if the tunnel had been holding its breath for 90 years. The crew froze. I stepped in with a flashlight. Behind the breached wall was a small chamber, about 6 feet deep and 8 wide. Dust hung like fog, and the walls were darkened with something more than mildew. The smell was sharp, metallic, and absolutely final. "Holy!" one of the workers muttered. I didn't say anything. I just stared. Lying crumpled in one corner was a skeleton. The clothes were decayed city worker blues, but still intact enough to show an old transit badge clipped to the belt. The bones lay in an unnatural posture, twisted, as if he died not screaming, but knowing. And next to the footless leg was a single Italian leather shoe. I knelt cautiously, not out of reverence, but out of self-preservation. The last thing I needed was to sneeze and inhale 1933. The skeleton wore what had once been a standard-issue city inspector's uniform. The badge, rusted but legible, read Roston, T, MTA. The belt was still threaded through his pelvis, bones fused stiff by time and weight. On the chest were 4 buttons, a cracked brass whistle, and a ring, dull gold, set with what looked like a chip of sapphire. Fancy for a city grunt. Maybe it was a retirement gift. Maybe it was hush money. One boot was still laced on. The other leg ended in nothing but bare bone, smooth at the ankle. No shoe, just a vacant space in the dust. And that's when I remembered what had been found in Haskett's bag. A lone Italian. Leather shoe, not belonging to him, never accounted for. "Well, I'll be damned," Kramer muttered. "We just dug up a corpse and a motive." "Not just that," I said. "We found Wolfe's cornerstone." He grunted. "Let's bag it, tag it, and let the fat man gloat." And oh, he would. Back at the brownstone, I presented the photographic evidence like a proud father at a grim christening. Wolfe, having settled into his chair with beer and buttered rye, gave me a glance that passed for applause in his world. "You are 10 minutes late," he said. "The beer has warmed." "Blame the MTA and the corpse." I placed the rusted transit badge on his desk, wrapped in sterile cloth. He regarded it like a museum curator facing an artifact with too much story behind it. "That," he said, "is truth. Fossilized, undistorted by opinion, immutable. Truth exhumed, Mr. Goodwin." Fritz entered with a fresh tray. Wolfe lifted the beer, sniffed, approved, and took a sip. Then he leaned back, eyes closing slightly in satisfaction. "I trust Inspector Kramer was properly combative." He tried to bite a forensic tech. You'd have enjoyed it. Wolfe sighed contentedly. A man murdered for silence. Another, decades later, for proximity. It is gratifying when the city's bedrock offers more than just bedbugs. He lifted his glass in salute. To the dead man, or to himself, I couldn't say. And somewhere, beneath a million footsteps, the tunnel whispered no more. By the time I'd folded the third newspaper and swallowed my second cup of coffee, Wolfe was still on his first bottle of Remmers, nursing it like it contained a cure for human company. I had laid out the Gazette, the Post, and the Times, in descending order of their dedication to libel, with the radio murmuring in the background about subway service resuming downtown. Fritz had tiptoed through twice with fresh toast and fresh silence. I scanned the headlines like a bounty hunter. Engineer's bones found in MTA tunnel, said one. Union leader tied to decades-old killing, said another. But it was page 6 that snagged me. Dead man's shoe cracks cold case. I decided not to read that one aloud. Wolfe, behind his desk like a monarch unbothered by peasantry, reached for his beer and glanced my way. You appear restless, Archie. I'm just wondering which of these rags gets the Pulitzer for poetic justice. He snorted. They'll give it to whoever uses the word closure most. The beer hissed. The city muttered. Wolfe drank, and I kept flipping pages. Sorello's name finally got what it had been chasing, front page placement. Unfortunately for him, it was above a fold that read, Union strongman charged in 1933 murder. His mugshot didn't flatter. Grease slicked his hair back like he was auditioning for a vintage villain role, and the eyes suggested the press conference hadn't gone his way. I expected Wolfe to revel in it. Maybe a smirk, maybe a soliloquy. But he bypassed the headline entirely and instead settled on a back-page editorial titled, Graft in City Cement the Quiet Rot. He tapped the column twice. Archie, read this. I did. It was a surprisingly lucid take on infrastructure corner-cutting, payoffs, and how bodies don't stay buried forever, not metaphorically or literally. Wolfe nodded. That is the story. Sorello is merely the punctuation. And Haskett? An ellipsis, waiting decades to be completed. I blinked. You're waxing poetic. He waved a dismissive hand, only because the beer is cold. I didn't argue. Wolfe poetic on Remmers was better than most men sober with a pipe organ. Carmela came by just once more, 2 days after the papers cooled off, but before Sorello's lawyer started spinning fables about mistaken identity and anti-labor conspiracies. She didn't sit. She didn't ask for tea. She didn't even meet Fritz's eyes when he opened the door. Wolfe offered her a chair. She ignored it and handed me an envelope with her fingers so steady, I suspected they were trained to hold scalpels or secrets. I want no receipt, she said. Wolfe opened it, glanced at the check, and passed it back to me without a word. It was 5 figures. The comma sat like an apology. I'm grateful, she said, but it sounded like punctuation. And I'm gone. As she turned, I found myself asking, Did you know? Back then. She paused at the door. I suspected. I didn't look. That's not the same. Then she left, leaving behind her perfume, the check Wolfe would never cash, and a line I'd file away for the next time. Someone told me silence was innocence. Wolfe looked up. We must never confuse absence with absolution. I nodded, but I kept thinking anyway. That night, with Wolfe tucked into his orchids and Fritz in the kitchen muttering about wine vinegar, I listened to Haskett's wire recording one last time. The sound of his voice, dry, papery, like a file drawer opening after decades, still gave me a chill. It wasn't just what he said, but how he said it. No drama, no remorse, just a quiet, exhausted truth finally allowed to stretch its legs. He spoke of tunnels and of fear, of silence, of a boot left behind and a loyalty that became a grave. And somewhere near the end, there was that phrase, whispers don't stay buried, not forever. I wondered how many other whispers were still trapped under the city's concrete skin, waiting for someone to notice a crack, a shift, a hollow echo behind a wall. Not all corpses make noise, but some wait patiently for someone like Wolfe or me to listen. I shut the machine off and sat in the quiet. Funny how loud that can be. With the newsprint drying up and the case filed away under closed but not forgotten, Wolfe did what Wolfe always does after a satisfactory intellectual purge. He vanished into his orchids like a philosopher into his private cathedral. The only sign of life from the plant rooms was the occasional buzz of the humidifier and the smell of peat moss battling it out with orchid feed. I found him mid-morning peering through a magnifier at a stubborn Miltonia. "It refuses symmetry," he grumbled. "Vulgar obstinacy." "Like Carmela?" "No," he said, adjusting the humidity dial. "She merely mistook silence for strategy. Sorello, a thug, a noisy stone sinking slowly. And Haskett, that gave him pause." He turned to me. "Justice, Mr. Goodwin, is not aesthetic, but it is satisfying." He returned to the Miltonia. I left him to it. You learn when Wolfe is finished talking. Sometimes it's the only kind of silence worth listening to. That evening, after Fritz served liver pate, Wolfe didn't comment on a sure sign of contentment. I poured the last inch of Remmers into his glass. He nodded once, which in Wolfe language is the equivalent of a standing ovation. I grabbed my coat, tipped my hat, and was halfway to the door when he said, without looking up, "I presume we are now at peace with the dead." "I don't think the dead care," I said, "but we can pretend." I stepped into the hall. The door closed behind me with the kind of soft click you only notice when the case is over and the city's humming again. Outside, the wind was back, pushing headlines down sidewalks and wrapping memories around lampposts. I lit a cigarette I didn't really want and muttered aloud, "Sometimes the dead whisper louder than the living yell. And sometimes, if you're listening right, you catch the truth before it sinks again." The tunnels beneath Manhattan no longer whisper, but the silence they leave behind speaks volumes. A body hidden in concrete, a bribe disguised as a bonus, and lives carefully arranged around secrets no one dared exhume. Until now. Wolfe returned to his orchids. Archie poured the last beer. Justice, in its quiet, stubborn way, found footing beneath the city's weight. But tell me, can silence be as guilty as action? And if a secret stays buried long enough, does it become part of the foundation? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed the mystery, be sure to like the video, share it with someone who loves detective stories, and subscribe for more. Not every case ends with applause, but the truth, once found, always echoes.